This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 51, The Liberal Outlook. During my visit to Pune to see Gandhiji, I accompanied him one evening to the Servants of India Society's home. For an hour or so, questions were put to him on political matters by some of the members of the society, and he answered them. Mr. Srinivas Shastri, the president of the society, was not there, nor was Pandit Hridaynath Kunjru, probably the ablest of the other members, but some senior members were present. A few of us who were present on the occasion listened with growing amazement, for the questions related to the most trivial of happenings. Mostly they dealt with Gandhiji's old request for an interview with the Viceroy and the Viceroy's refusal. Was this the only important subject they could think of in a world full of problems, and when their own country was carrying on a hard struggle for freedom and hundreds of organizations were outlawed? There was the agrarian crisis and the industrial depression causing widespread unemployment. There were the dreadful happenings in Bengal and the frontier and in other parts of India, the suppression of freedom of thought and speech and writing and assembly, and so many other national and international problems. But the questions were limited to unimportant happenings, and the possible reactions of the Viceroy and the Government of India to an approach by Gandhiji. I had a strong feeling as if I had entered a monastery, the inhabitants of which had long been cut off from effective contact with the outside world. And yet our friends were active politicians, able men with long records of public service and sacrifice. They formed, with a few others, the real backbone of the Liberal Party. The rest of the party was a vague, amorphous lot of people who wanted occasionally to have the sensation of being connected with political activities. Some of these, especially in Bombay and Madras, were indistinguishable from government officials. The questions that a country puts are a measure of that country's political development. Often the failure of that country is due to the fact that it has not put the right question to itself. Our wasting our time and energy and tempers over the communal distribution of seats, or our forming parties on the communal award and carrying on a sterile controversy about it to the exclusion of vital problems, is a measure of our political backwardness. In the same way, the questions that were put to Gandhiji that day in the Servants of India Society's home mirrored the strange mental state of that society and of the Liberal Party. They seemed to have no political or economic principles, no wide outlook, and their politics seemed to be of the parlour or court variety, what high officials would do or would not do. One is apt to be misled by the name Liberal Party. The word elsewhere, and especially in England, stood for a certain economic policy, free trade and laissez-faire, etc., and a certain ideology of individual freedom and civil liberties. The English liberal tradition was based on economic foundations. The desire for freedom in trade and to be rid of the king's monopolies and arbitrary taxation led to the desire for political liberty. The Indian liberals have no such background. They do not believe in free trade, being almost all protectionists, and they attach little importance to civil liberties, as recent events have shown. Their close contacts with and general support of the semi-feudal and autocratic Indian states, where even the beginnings of democracy and personal freedom are non-existent, also distinguish them from the European type of liberal. Indeed, the Indian liberals are not liberal at all in any sense of the word, or at most they are liberal only in spots and patches. What they exactly are, it is difficult to say, for they have no firm positive basis of ideas, and though small in numbers, differ from one another. They are strong only in negation. They see error everywhere and attempt to avoid it, and hope that in doing so they will find the truth. Truth for them indeed always lies between two extremes. By criticizing everything they consider extreme, they experience the feeling of being virtuous and moderate and good. This method helps them in avoiding painful and difficult processes of thought and in having to put forward constructive ideas. Capitalism, some of them vaguely feel, has not wholly succeeded in Europe and is in trouble. On the other hand, socialism is obviously bad because it attacks vested interests. Probably some mystic solution will be found in the future, some halfway house, and meanwhile, vested interests should be protected. If there was an argument as to whether the earth was flat or round, probably they would condemn both these extreme views and suggest tentatively that it might be square or elliptical. Over trivial and unimportant matters they grow quite excited, and there is an amazing amount of hoo-ha and shouting. Consciously and subconsciously they avoid tackling fundamental issues, for such issues require fundamental remedies and the courage of thought and action. Hence liberal defeats and victories are of little consequence. They relate to no principle. The leading characteristic of the party and the distinguishing feature, if it can be considered so, is thus moderation in everything, good or bad. It is an outlook on life, and the old name, the moderates, was perhaps the most suitable. In moderation, placing all my glory while Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory. Alexander Pope. But moderation, however admirable it might be, is not a bright and scintillating virtue. It produces dullness, and so the Indian liberals have unhappily become a dull brigade. Sombre and serious in their looks, dull in their writing and conversation, and lacking in humour. Of course there are exceptions, and the most notable of these is Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru, who in his personal life is certainly not dull or lacking in humour, and who enjoys even a joke against himself. But on the whole the Liberal group represents bourgeoisdom in excelsis with all its pedestrian solidity. The leader of Allahabad, which is the leading Liberal newspaper, had a revealing editorial note last year. It stated that great and unusual men had always brought trouble to the world, and therefore it preferred the ordinary, mediocre kind of man. With a fine and frank gesture it nailed its flag to mediocrity. Moderation and conservatism and a desire to avoid risks and sudden changes are often the inevitable accompaniments of old age. They do not seem quite so appropriate in the young, but ours is an ancient land, and sometimes its children seem to be born, tired and weary, with all the lacklustre and marks of age upon them. But even this old country is now convulsed by the forces of change, and the moderate outlook is bewildered. The old world is passing, and all the sweet reasonableness of which the Liberals are capable does not make any difference. They might as well argue with the hurricane, or the flood, or the earthquake. Old assumptions fail them, and they dare not seek for new ways of thought and action. Dr. A. N. Whitehead, speaking of the European tradition, says, "The whole of this tradition is warped by the vicious assumption that each generation will substantially live amid the conditions governing the lives of its fathers, and will transmit those conditions to mold with equal force the lives of its children. We are living in the first period of human history for which the assumption is false." Dr. Whitehead errs on the side of moderation in his analysis, for probably that assumption has always been untrue. If the European tradition has been conservative, how much more so has ours been. But the mechanics of history pay little attention to these traditions when the time for change comes. We watch helplessly and blame others for the failure of our plans. And that, as Mr. Gerald Hurd points out, is the most disastrous of illusions, the projection that convinces itself that any failure in one's plans must be due not to a mistake in one's own thinking, but to a deliberate thwarting by someone else. All of us suffer from this terrible illusion. I sometimes think that Gandhiji is not free from it, but we act at least and try to keep in touch with life, and by trial and error sometimes lessen the power of the illusion and stumble along. But the Liberals suffer most. For they do not act for fear of acting wrongly, they do not move for fear of falling. They keep away from all healthy contacts with the masses and sit enchanted and self-hypnotized in their mental cells. Mr. Srinivas Shastri warned his fellow Liberals a year and a half ago not to stand by and let things pass. That warning had greater truth in it than he himself probably realized. Thinking always in terms of what the government did, He was referring to the constitutional changes that were being hatched by various official committees. But the misfortune of the Liberals had been that they stood by and let things pass when their own people were marching ahead. They feared their own masses, and they preferred to alienate themselves from these masses rather than fall out with our rulers. Was it any wonder that they became strangers in their own land, and life went by and left them standing? When fierce struggles were waged for life and freedom by their countrymen, there was no doubt on which side of the barricade the Liberals stood. From the other side of that barricade they gave us good advice, and were full of moral platitudes, laying them on thick like sticky paint. Their cooperation with the British government in the Round Table conferences and committees was a moral factor of value to the government. A denial of it would have made a difference. It was remarkable that at one of these conferences even the British Labour Party kept away. Not so our Liberals, who went in spite of an appeal by some Britishers to them not to do so. We are all moderates or extremists in varying degrees and for various objects. If we care enough for anything, we are likely to feel strongly about it, to be extremist about it. Otherwise, we can afford a gracious tolerance, a philosophical moderation, which really hides to some extent our indifference. I have known the mildest of moderates to grow very aggressive and extremist when a suggestion was made for the sweeping away of certain vested interests in land. Our Liberal friends represent to some extent the prosperous and well-to-do. They can afford to wait for Swaraj and need not excite themselves about it. But any proposal for radical social change disturbs them greatly, and they are no longer moderate or sweetly reasonable about it. Thus, their moderation is really confined to their attitude towards the British government, and they nurse the hope that if they are sufficiently respectful and compromising perhaps, as a reward for this behavior, they might be listened to. Inevitably they have to accept the British viewpoint. Blue books become their passionate study, Erskine May's parliamentary practice, and such like books their constant companions, a new government report a matter for excitement and speculation. Liberal leaders returning from England make mysterious statements about the doings of the great ones in Whitehall, for Whitehall is the Valhalla of Liberals, responsivists, and other similar groups. In the old days it was said that good Americans when they died went to Paris, and it may be that the shades of good Liberals sometimes haunt the precincts of Whitehall. I write of Liberals, but what I write applies to many of us also in the Congress. It applies even more to the responsivists who have outdistanced the Liberals in their moderation. There is a great deal of difference between the average Liberal and the average Congressman, and yet the dividing line is not clear and definite. Ideologically, there is little to choose between the advanced Liberal and the moderate Congressman. But thanks to Gandhiji, every Congressman has kept some touch with the soil and the people of the country, and he has dabbled in action, and because of this he has escaped some of the consequences of a vague and defective ideology. Not so the Liberals, they have lost touch with both the old and the new. As a group they represent a vanishing species. Most of us, I suppose, have lost the old pagan feeling and not gained the new insight. Not for us to have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn, and very few of us are fortunate enough. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Not for most of us, unhappily, to sense the mysterious life of nature, to hear her whisper close to our ears, to thrill and quiver at her touch. Those days are gone, but though we may not see the sublime in nature as we used to, we have sought to find it in the glory and tragedy of humanity, in its mighty dreams and inner tempests, its pangs and failures, its conflicts and misery, and, over all this, its faith in a great destiny and a realization of those dreams. That has been some recompense for us for all the heartbreaks that such a search involves, and often we have been raised above the pettiness of life. But many have not undertaken this search, and having cut themselves adrift from the ancient ways, find no road to follow in the present. They neither dream nor do they act. They have no understanding of human convulsions like the Great French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. The complex, swift, and cruel eruptions of human desires, long suppressed, frighten them. For them, the Bastille has not yet fallen. It is often said with righteous indignation that patriotism is not a monopoly of congressmen. The same phrase is repeated again and again with a lack of originality which is somewhat distressing. I hope no congressman has ever claimed a corner in this emotion. Certainly, I do not think it is a Congress monopoly, and I would be glad to make a present of it to anyone who desired it. It is often enough the refuge of the opportunist and the careerist, and there are so many varieties of it to suit all tastes, all interests, all classes. If Judas had been alive today, he would no doubt act in its name. Patriotism is no longer enough. We want something higher, wider, and nobler. Nor is moderation enough by itself. Restraint is good and is the measure of our culture, but behind that restraint there must be something to restrain and hold back. It has been and is man's destiny to control the elements, to ride the thunderbolt, to bring the raging fire and the rushing and tumbling waters to his use, but most difficult of all for him has been to restrain and hold in check the passions that consume him. So long as he will not master them, he cannot enter fully into his human heritage. But are we to restrain the legs that move not and the hands that are palsied? I cannot resist the temptation to quote 4 lines of Roy Campbell's written on some South African novelists. They seem to be equally applicable to various political groups in India. They praise the firm restraint with which you write. I'm with you there, of course. You use the snaffle and the curb all right, but where's the bloody horse? Our liberal friends tell us that they follow the narrow path of the golden mean and steer themselves between the extremes of the Congress and the government. They constitute themselves the judges of the failings of both, and congratulate themselves that they are free from either. They endeavor to hold the scales, and, like the figure of justice, I suppose, they keep their eyes closed or bandaged. Is it my fancy merely that takes me back through the ages and makes me listen to that famous cry, "Scribes and Pharisees, ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel"? End of chapter 51. Chapter 52. Dominion, Status, and Independence. Most of those who have shaped Congress policy during the last 17 years have come from the middle classes. Liberal or congressmen, they have come from the same class and have grown up in the same environment. Their social life and contacts and friendships have been similar, and there was little difference to begin with between the 2 varieties of bourgeois ideals that they professed. Temperamental and psychological differences began to separate them, and they began to look in different directions, one group more towards the government and the rich upper middle class, the other towards the lower middle classes. The ideology still remained the same. The objectives did not differ, but behind the second group there was now the push of larger numbers from the marketplace and the humbler professions as well as the unemployed intelligentsia. The tone changed. It was no longer respectful and polite, but strident and aggressive. Lacking strength to act effectively, some relief was found in strong language. Frightened by this new development, the moderate elements dropped out and sought safety in seclusion. Even so, the upper middle class was strongly represented in the Congress, though in numbers the little bourgeoisie was predominant. They were drawn not only by the desire for success in their national struggle, but because they sought an inner satisfaction in that struggle. They sought thereby to recover their lost pride and self-respect, and to rehabilitate their shattered dignity. It was the usual nationalist urge, and though this was common to all, it was here that the temperamental differences between the moderate and the extremist became evident. Gradually the lower middle class began to dominate the Congress, and later the peasantry made their influence felt. As the Congress became more and more the representative of the rural masses, the gulf that separated it from the liberals widened, and it became almost impossible for the liberal to understand or appreciate the Congress viewpoint. It is not easy for the upper-class drawing-room to understand the humble cottage or the mud hut. Yet in spite of these differences, both the ideologies were nationalist and bourgeois. The variation was one of degree, not of kind. In the Congress, many people remained to the last who would have been quite at home in the liberal group. For many generations, the British treated India as a kind of enormous country house after the old English fashion that they owned. They were the gentry owning the house and occupying the desirable parts of it, while the Indians were consigned to the servants' hall and pantry and kitchen. As in every proper country house, there was a fixed hierarchy in those lower regions: butler, housekeeper, cook, valet, maid, footman, etc., and strict precedence was observed among them. But between the upper and lower regions of the house there was, socially and politically, an impassable barrier. The fact that the British government should have imposed this arrangement upon us was not surprising, but what does seem surprising is that we, or most of us, accepted it as the natural and inevitable ordering of our lives and destiny. We developed the mentality of a good country house servant. Sometimes we were treated to a rare honor. We were given a cup of tea in the drawing room. The height of our ambition was to become respectable and to be promoted individually to the upper regions. Greater than any victory of arms or diplomacy was this psychological triumph of the British in India. The slave began to think as a slave, as the wise men of old had said. Times have changed, and the country house type of civilization is not accepted willingly now, either in England or India. But still there remain people amongst us who desire to stick to the servants' halls and take pride in the gold braid and livery of their service. Others, like the liberals, accept that country house in its entirety, admire its architecture and the whole edifice, but look forward to replacing the owners one by themselves. They call this Indianization. For them, the problem is one of changing the color of the administration, or at most having a new administration. They never think in terms of a new state. For them, Swaraj means that everything continues as before, only with a darker shade. They can only conceive of a future in which they, or people like them, will play the principal role and take the place of the English high officials, in which there are the same types of services, government departments, legislatures, trade, industry, with the ICS at their jobs, the princes in their palaces, occasionally appearing in fancy dress or carnival attire, with all their jewels glittering to impress their subjects, the landlords claiming special protection and meanwhile harassing their tenants, the money-lender with his money bags, harassing both zamindar and tenant, the lawyer with his fees, and God in his heaven. Essentially, their outlook is based on the maintenance of the status quo, and the changes they desire can almost be termed personal changes. And they seek to achieve these changes by a slow infiltration with the goodwill of the British. The whole foundation of their politics and economics rests on the continuance and stability of the British Empire. Looking on this empire as unshakable, at least for a considerable time, they adapt themselves to it and accept not only its political and economic ideology, but also to a large extent its moral standards, which have all been framed to secure the continuance of British dominance. The Congress attitude differs fundamentally from this because it seeks a new state and not just a different administration. What that new state is going to be may not be quite clear to the average congressman, and opinions may differ about it. But it is common ground in the Congress, except perhaps for a moderate fringe, that present conditions and methods cannot and must not continue, and basic changes are essential. Herein lies the difference between dominion status and independence. The former envisages the same old structure, with many bonds visible and invisible tying us to the British economic system. The latter gives us, or ought to give us, freedom to erect a new structure to suit our circumstances. It is not a question of an implacable and irreconcilable antagonism to England and the English people, or the desire to break from them at all costs. It would be natural enough if there was bad blood between India and England after what has happened. "The clumsiness of power spoils the key and uses the pickaxe," says Tagore, "and the key to our hearts was destroyed long ago, and the abundant use of the pickaxe on us has not made us partial to the British. But if we claim to serve the larger cause of India and humanity, we cannot afford to be carried away by our momentary passions. And even if we were so inclined, the hard training which Gandhiji has given us for the last 15 years would prevent us. I write this sitting in a British prison, and for months past my mind has been full of anxiety, and I have perhaps suffered more during this solitary imprisonment than I have done in jail before. Anger and resentment have often filled my mind, at various happenings, and yet as I sit here and look deep into my mind and heart, I do not find any anger against England or the English people. I dislike British imperialism, and I resent its imposition on India. I dislike the capitalist system. I dislike exceedingly and resent the way India is exploited by the ruling classes of Britain. But I do not hold England or the English people as a whole responsible for this, and even if I did, I do not think it would make much difference, for it is a little foolish to lose one's temper at or to condemn a whole people. They are as much the victims of circumstances as we are. Personally, I owe too much to England in my mental make-up ever to feel wholly alien to her. And do what I will, I cannot get rid of the habits of mind and the standards and ways of judging other countries as well as life generally, which I acquired at school and college in England. All my predilections, apart from the political plane, are in favour of England and the English people, and if I have become what is called an uncompromising opponent of British rule in India, it is almost in spite of myself. It is that rule, that domination, to which we object, and with which we cannot compromise willingly, not the English people. Let us by all means have the closest contacts with the English and other foreign peoples. We want fresh air in India, fresh and vital ideas, healthy cooperation. We have grown too musty with age. But if the English come in the role of a tiger, they can expect no friendship or cooperation. To the tiger of imperialism, there will only be the fiercest opposition, and today our country has to deal with that ferocious animal. It may be possible to tame the wild tiger of the forest and to charm away his native ferocity, but there is no such possibility of taming capitalism and imperialism when they combine and swoop down on an unhappy land. For anyone to say that he or his country will not compromise is in a sense a foolish remark, for life is always forcing us to compromise. When applied to another country or people, it is completely foolish. But there is truth in it when it is applied to a system or a particular set of circumstances, and then it becomes something beyond human power to accomplish. Indian freedom and British imperialism are two incompatibles, and neither martial law nor all the sugar-coating in the world can make them compatible or bring them together. Only with the elimination of British imperialism from India will conditions be created which permit of real Indo-British cooperation. We are told that independence is a narrow creed in the modern world, which is increasingly becoming interdependent, and therefore in demanding independence we are trying to put the dock back. Liberals and pacifists and even so-called socialists in Britain advance this plea and chide us for our narrow nationalism, and incidentally suggest to us that the way to a fuller national life is through the British Commonwealth of Nations. It is curious how all roads in England, liberalism, pacifism, socialism, etc., lead to the maintenance of the empire. The desire of a ruling nation to maintain the status quo, says Trotsky, frequently dresses up as a superiority to nationalism, just as the desire of a victorious nation to hang on to its booty easily takes the form of pacifism. Thus MacDonald, in the face of Gandhi, feels as though he were an internationalist. I do not know what India will be like or what she will do when she is politically free. But I do know that those of her people who stand for national independence today stand also for the widest internationalism. For a socialist, nationalism can have no meaning, but even many of the non-socialists in the advanced ranks of the Congress are confirmed internationalists. If we claim independence today, it is with no desire for isolation. On the contrary, we are perfectly willing to surrender part of that independence in common with other countries to a real international order. Any imperial system, by whatever high-sounding name it may be called, is an enemy of such an order, and it is not through such a system that world cooperation or world peace can be reached. Recent developments have shown all over the world how the various imperialist systems are isolating themselves more and more by autarky and economic imperialism. Instead of the growth of internationalism, we see a reversal of the process. The reasons for this are not difficult to discover, and they indicate the growing weakness of the present economic order. One of the results of this policy is that while it produces greater cooperation within the area of autarky, it also means isolation from the rest of the world. For India, as we have seen by Ottawa and other decisions, it has meant a progressive lessening of our ties and contacts with other countries. We have become, even more than we were, the hangers-on of British industry, and the dangers of this policy, apart from the immediate harm it has done in various ways, are obvious. Thus, Dominion status seems to lead to isolation and not to wider international contacts. Our friends the Indian Liberals, however, have an amazing knack of seeing the world, and more particularly their own country, through British spectacles of true blue colour. Without trying to appreciate what the Congress says and why it says so, they repeat the old British argument of independence being narrower and less soul-lifting than Dominion status. Internationalism means for them Whitehall, for they are singularly ignorant of other countries, partly because of the language difficulty, but even more so because they are quite content to ignore them. They are, of course, averse to direct action or any kind of aggressive politics in India. But it is curious to note that some of their leaders have no objection to such methods being adopted in other countries. They can appreciate and admire them from a distance, and some of the present-day dictators of Western countries receive their mental homage. Names are apt to mislead, but the real question before us in India is whether we are aiming at a new state or merely at a new administration. The Liberal answer is clear. They want the latter and nothing more, and even that is a distant and progressive ideal. The words Dominion status are mentioned from time to time, but their real objective for the time being is expressed in those mystic words responsibility at the center. Not for them the full-blooded words power, independence, freedom, liberty. They sound dangerous. The lawyer's language and approach appeals to them far more, even though it may not enthuse the multitude. History has innumerable instances of individuals and groups facing perils and risking their lives for the sake of faith and freedom. It seems doubtful if anyone will ever deliberately give up a meal or sleep less soundly for responsibility at the center or any other legal phrase. This, then, is their objective, and this is to be reached not by direct action or any other form of aggressive action, but, as Mr. Srinivas Shastri put it, by a display of wisdom, experience, moderation, power of persuasion, quiet influence, and real efficiency. It is hoped that by our good behavior and our good work, we shall ultimately induce our rulers to part with power. In other words, they resist us today because either they are irritated against us on account of our aggressive attitude, or they doubt our capacity, or both. This seems a rather naive analysis of imperialism and the present situation. That brilliant English writer, Professor R. H. Tawney, has written an appropriate and arresting passage dealing with the notion of gaining power in stages and with the cooperation of the ruling classes. He refers to the British Labour Party, but his words are even more applicable to India, for in England they have at least democratic institutions, where the will of the majority can, in theory, make itself felt. Professor Tawney writes, "Onions can be eaten leaf by leaf, but you cannot skin a live tiger paw by paw. Vivisection is its trade, and it does the skinning first. If there is any country where the privileged classes are simpletons, it is certainly not England. The idea that tact and amiability in presenting the Labour Party's case can hoodwink them into the belief that it is their case also is as hopeless as an attempt to bluff a sharp solicitor out of a property of which he holds the title deeds. The plutocracy consists of agreeable, astute, forcible, self-confident, and, when hard-pressed, unscrupulous people who know pretty well on which side their bread is buttered, and intend that the supply of butter shall not run short. If their position is seriously threatened, they will use every piece on the board, political and economic, the House of Lords, the Crown, the press, disaffection in the army, financial crisis, international difficulties, and even, as newspaper attacks on the pound in 1931 showed, the émigré trick of injuring one's country to protect one's pocket. The British Labour Party is a powerful organisation. It is backed by the trade unions, with their millions of paying members, and a highly developed cooperative organisation, as well as many members and sympathisers among the professional classes. Britain has democratic parliamentary institutions based on adult suffrage and a long tradition of civil liberty. In spite of all this, Mr. Tawney is of opinion, and recent events have confirmed the soundness of this, that the Labour Party cannot hope to gain real power merely by smiling and persuasion, useful and desirable as both these approaches are. Mr. Tawney suggests that even if the Labour Party obtained a majority in the House of Commons, it would still be powerless to make any radical change in face of the opposition of the privileged classes, who hold so many political, social, economic, financial and military citadels. In India, it need hardly be pointed out, conditions are very different. There are no democratic institutions or traditions. We have instead a well-established practice of ordinance and dictatorial rule, and the suppression of the liberties of the person, of speech, writing, assembly, and the press. Nor have the Liberals any strong organization behind them. They have thus to rely on their smile alone. Liberals are strongly opposed to any activity that is unconstitutional or illegal. In countries with democratic constitutions, the word constitutional has a wide significance. It controls the making of laws, it protects liberties, it checks the executive, it provides for the democratic methods of bringing about changes in the political and economic structure. But in India, there is no such constitution, and the word can mean no such thing. Footnote: Mr. C.Y. Chintamani, the eminent Liberal leader and editor-in-chief of the Leader newspaper, has himself laid stress on the lack of any kind of constitutional government in India in his criticism in the UP Council of the report of the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee on India. Better submit to the present unconstitutional government rather than to the more reactionary and furthermore unconstitutional government of the future. End of footnote. To use it here is merely to introduce an idea which has no place in the India of today. The word constitutional is often used here, strange to say, in support of the executive's more or less arbitrary actions. Or else it is used in the sense of legal. It is far better to confine ourselves to the words legal or illegal, though they are vague enough and vary from day to day. A new ordinance or a new law creates new offences. To attend a public meeting may be an offence, so also to ride a bicycle, to wear certain clothes, not to be home by sunset, not to report oneself to the police daily. All these and numerous other acts are offences today in some part of India. A certain act may be an offence in one part of the country and not in another. When these laws can be promulgated by an irresponsible executive at the shortest notice, the word legal simply means the will of that executive and nothing more. Ordinarily that will is obeyed, willingly or sullenly, because the consequences of disobedience are unpleasant. But for anyone to say that he will always obey it means abject submission to a dictatorship or irresponsible authority, the surrender of his conscience, and the impossibility of ever gaining freedom, so far as his activities are concerned. In every democratic country today, there is an argument going on as to whether radical economic changes can be brought about in the ordinary course through the constitutional machinery at their disposal. Many people are of opinion that this cannot be done, and some unusual and revolutionary method will have to be adopted. For our purpose in India, the issue of this argument is immaterial, for we have no constitutional means of bringing about the changes we desire. If the white paper or something like it is enacted, constitutional progress in many directions will be stopped completely. There is no way out except by revolution or illegal action. What then is one to do? Give up all idea of change and resign oneself to fate? The position today in India is even more extraordinary. The executive can and does prevent or restrict all manner of public activities. Any activity that is, in its opinion, dangerous for it is prohibited. Thus, all effective public activity can be stopped, as it was stopped during the last 3 years. Submission to this means giving up all public work. That is an impossible position to take up. No one can say that he will always and without fail act legally. Even in a democratic state, occasions may arise when one's conscience compels one to act otherwise. In a despotically or arbitrarily governed country, these occasions are bound to be more frequent. Indeed, in such a state, the law loses all moral justification. Direct action is allied to dictatorship and not democracy, and those who wish to bring about the triumph of democracy must eschew direct action, say the liberals. This is confused thinking and loose writing. Sometimes direct action, for example, a workers' strike, may even be legal, but probably political action was meant. In Germany today under Hitler, what kind of action is possible? Either abject submission or illegal and revolutionary action. How could democracy be served there? Indian liberals often refer to democracy, but most of them have no desire to go near it. Sir P.S. Shivswamy Iyer, one of the most prominent of liberal leaders, said in May 1934, "In advocating the convention of a constituent assembly, the Congress places too much faith in the wisdom of the multitude and does too little justice to the sincerity and ability of men who have taken part in various round-table conferences. I very much doubt whether the Constituent Assembly would have done better. Sir Shivswamy's idea of democracy is thus something apart from the multitude, and fits in more with a collection of sincere and able men nominated by the British government. Further, he blesses the white paper, for though not fully satisfied with it, he thought it would be unwise for the country to oppose it wholesale. There appears to be no reason whatever why there should not be the most perfect cooperation between the British government and Sir P.S. Shivswamy Iyer. The withdrawal of civil disobedience by the Congress was naturally welcomed by the Liberals. It was also not surprising that they should take credit for their wisdom in having kept aloof from this foolish and ill-advised movement. Did we not say so? They told us. It was a strange argument, because when we stood up and put up a good fight, we were knocked down. Therefore, the moral pointed out was that standing up is a bad thing. Crawling is best and safest. It is quite impossible to be knocked down or to fall from that horizontal position. End of chapter 52.